tonight, we're proud to present award-winning documentary filmmaker Rory Kennedy and her husband and author Mark Bailey. And they are longtime Malibu residents, which makes it much sweeter. So Rory Kennedy is the youngest child of U.S. Senator Robert Bobby Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy, and has made more than 30 acclaimed films, including what we'll be seeing a bit of tonight, the Academy Award-nominated Last Days in Vietnam. So Rory really tackles a lot of big topics in her films, like addiction, nuclear radiation, and the treatment of prisoners of war. And her husband, Mark Bailey, is an author of screenplays, documentaries, and books, including the screenplay of Last Days in Vietnam. And he's written feature screenplays for numerous studios, as well as 4 books, including a wonderful children's book that I have, and he's been nominated for several Emmys. But what's also so important to me, and I know many of you in the audience know Rory and Mark or have seen them around town, is they've really become involved in their community. They give of themselves, and this is just another example of it. And so please join me in welcoming Rory Kennedy and Mark Bailey.
Thank you, Laura.
This is Rory. That's Mark.
Hi.
So I know this evening we're going to be watching some clips from Last Days in Vietnam. So why don't you tell us a little bit, where did this film come from? What is it about? Tell us a little bit about why this? Why did you do this movie?
First of all, I just want to thank you all for coming here this evening. We're very excited to be here in Malibu, in our community, in our neighborhood, talking to you all. And it's great to be able to share some clips from Last Days in Vietnam and our experience in making it. And thank you to Laura for moderating this discussion and being here. And it's fantastic that the library is doing this series. So we're really thrilled to be here. So I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've been making documentaries for about 25 years. Mark Samuels from PBS, American Experience, which is a series on PBS, approached me and asked if I would be interested in doing a film about the final days of the Vietnam War. And I was immediately interested in it. I've always been fascinated with Vietnam. From a very young age, my father, Robert Kennedy, ran his last campaign in 1968 really because he was invested in us getting out of Vietnam as a country. So from a very young age, I was aware of Vietnam. I had an appreciation of the role it played in our history and how important it was. So I was interested in it. My reservation, honestly, was a sense that there had been so much done about Vietnam, and could we add anything new to what was already out there? And Mark is my partner in making these films, and we talked about it and then started doing research on it, and both kind of realized that this was a story that we didn't know, that we thought we know, but we really didn't know the details of this story, and it was kind of mind-blowing how extraordinary the story was in and of itself. And then, we also began to uncover these really extraordinary personal stories of Americans and South Vietnamese who had done everything they could, arguably risking their lives to save as many South Vietnamese as possible. And so to also at the same time kind of uncover this sense that, wow, I didn't, heroes, American heroes in Vietnam, it was kind of antithetical to what I knew and what I associated with that war. And so we felt, pretty immediately that there was a very compelling story that needed to be told.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think in American Experience, in Mark Samuels' mind, was that this past spring was the 40th anniversary of us leaving. And so, he kind of had come to us a good bit before that with the idea that that occasion would be a really, good time to get the nation to sort of look back. And that also, at the same time, what was going on is that, we're in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're talking about how to extricate ourselves from those places and what our commitment are to, our allies there. And so I think that both Rory and I felt like it was a story that was, all a part of our history and a part of our recent history, but that it had a real immediate relevance. And so it could kind of operate on both levels. And I think that that way of looking back is really useful.
So, and that's one of the questions I had. So how do you see this film in kind of our evolving narrative of the Vietnam War over the last 40 or 50 years? Could this story have been told 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, I think it would have been trickier. I think that really coming out of the war, and it was interesting talking to really the men. I mean, I'm very sensitive to being inclusive of women, but this was really men in this situation who, when they were talking about what they went through during those final days, which I think for those of you who have seen the entire film, and I think you'll see some clips of it tonight that demonstrated, although there are many more in the film, that they didn't think of themselves as heroes. And I think that part of that was that there was no narrative that supported that coming out of the war, that this was a war that as a nation, I think we were embarrassed about, that we had really lost this war, that we had abandoned our allies during this moment of need, that there was kind of these images that I think many of us are familiar with of the helicopters leaving the embassy and the Vietnamese desperately trying to get out. These are people who we had committed ourselves to and who we really left behind. So I think that was the context, and that was kind of the story of that war. And as a nation, we really wanted to move on and not really, I think, contemplate what happened and how we had failed, particularly during the end, which is why, I would say that the dominant response in showing this film to audiences across the country is this sense of, wow, I thought I knew the story. I didn't know the story. And this is coming from scholars, from people who've studied Vietnam, from politicians, and even people who were in the film when we first showed the film at Sundance, and it was the first time they saw the film, it was the first time they understood what had actually happened. Because each person is sort of filling in a certain part of the story, and we focus a lot on those last 24 hours, but people were in different locations, and they actually didn't know what was happening in different places until they saw this film. So I think that, really it took a few decades for us as a nation to be able to look back at these events, to reflect on it, and to kind of see it for, I think, what it is, which the film documents.
So there's so much footage out there.
Yeah.
So how did you choose what you chose? What process did you use? Were you looking for particular types of stories? Were you looking for, and I would say this to both of you, what was your decision process like on that?
Well, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think that what was helpful with this, when you have such, a big event like this with so many different players and so many different places, we sort of, on a macro level, set up certain rules about what we wanted to do. We knew we wanted to be in Saigon and sort of stay in Saigon and deal with what happened on the ground there from that vantage point, from that point of view, and confine ourselves to sort of knowing what each of the participants knew when they knew it, and not bouncing around. And then, so that all of a sudden cuts off a lot. And, another sort of important, I think, decision we made was, and along those lines, was just to talk to people who were there, not to talk to historians who were looking back, who weren't, didn't have firsthand experience in the events. And so you kind of make these rules, and it whittles it down, and then you're in Saigon, you're just talking to people who were there in Saigon, and or on boats in the South China Sea, and you're then figuring out, well, what are the different pieces of this, and who can I get to give me a window into that? So who can I talk to who is at the embassy who was military, and who can I talk to who is at the embassy who was a civilian, and who's, and you start to kind of work with it that way, and you're putting together this mosaic, and you're you're figuring it out.
Can I ask how many people here have actually seen the film, so we just have a sense? Oh, that's so nice. Thank you all. So maybe
They
a little
did their
bit,
homework.
yeah, a little bit more than half. So that's great. So just in terms of helping for us to know what you all know and what we need to kind of fill in. But maybe it would be helpful to show the first clip of the film for those who haven't seen it to kind of set the context of the general direction that we take in the film.
So they'll be on these two screens, and then for those of you who can't see those, there are two TVs out there also that you'll be able to see. But these are the best. So
this is the opening of the film. It's the first couple minutes.
So. So that's the beginning. It's kind of the unraveling of everything, and it's the moral dilemma: who stays and who gets to go. So, why start with that? What were you trying to set up there? What was the?
Well, I think that in some ways that was kind of the premise of the film, right? And that's ended up what we felt was really kind of the core of our story. Because the larger context of what was happening here is, the war had ended, the American troops had left. This is 2 years after, but there had been a peace agreement between the North and the South. The North came in, they invaded, they broke the peace agreement, and the United States didn't come back, and so it toppled very, very quickly. And so then the question is, there were about 7,000 Americans who were still there, who were at the embassy and kind of keeping the peace. Who gets out of the country during those final days, those final hours? And not only in terms of the Americans leaving and other foreigners, but of course the South Vietnamese. And to us that was kind of the core question and the ultimate abandonment of our allies is kind of the larger story that we tell in this film. But within that context, there are these extraordinary stories of Americans and South Vietnamese who really risked everything to save as many South Vietnamese as possible. And that, to us, felt like this was a story I didn't know. I knew the embassy, I knew the helicopters leaving. There were parts of the story that I knew. There were many parts of, the actual events and the chain of events that happened that I didn't know. But, the big kind of picture I knew. But that story of these people committing these extraordinary acts was something that was really new to me, and I felt was, and we all felt, as a team was revelatory. And so I think, that was kind of, I think, a broader question of the war and a more narrow question of these individuals who we ended up focusing on.
Yeah, I think that sort of, and you see it there in people talking about it, that the communists are coming down and there's a great deal of fear. And the Americans are, it's not as much that they're afraid for themselves or if they're going to get out, that 6,000 or 7,000. It's that we had been in Vietnam for so long, and we had really been entrenched in the community in a different way than we have been since, and probably really were before. So people have, South Vietnamese wives and South Vietnamese children, and they have the military counterparts that they've worked with for years. And so everybody's drawing up lists, who can I take with me? And then it's not just them, it's their family, right? Because you're a counterpart, and you're not going to leave your wife and your 3 kids. And so, it's numbers, and who's it going to be, and how are we going to organize for these people, and how much time do we have? And so that kind of was the swirl, and it all happened across 1 month, essentially. And so it all happens. I mean, they've come in, but there's a huge fiasco in the city of Da Nang at the end of March, where the writing is on the wall, and most people in the know get this country's lost. And then we end up leaving at the end of April. So it's really that month of April that that the North came into Saigon. And so that scramble is and how that was organized and all of that, and who stepped up and who didn't.
And I would say that that clip, which now is that scene and that moment, used to be in the body of the film, and then at some point, pretty late in the editing process, we decided to open with that because we felt that it said, this is a film about individual stories, and it is a film about kind of this question. It's not going to be your traditional film, a historical film about this moment in history with a narrator who kind of takes you through it with experts. It's going to be very much a story about these individuals. And we felt that clip really sort of captured a few things that we wanted to do and how we wanted to set up the overall film.
Well, and it did set up that moral dilemma. And so why do you think, in hindsight now, why didn't we hear these stories of heroism on both sides? Taking care of their counterparts in the South Vietnamese.
I mean, I have, one of the things that's interesting, and it's been interesting and really rewarding going out with the film and being with Vietnam veterans and seeing their response to the film, and also talking to a lot of the participants in the project who were there. And, I think that despite individual acts, overall, it was a debacle. And it was this ignominious departure where people are clawing at our embassy walls and we have Marines fighting them down, and where people who we've made promises to are abandoned in the embassy courtyard. So in the big picture, it was a fiasco. But you do have the people who aren't making the policy and who aren't involved in these giant decisions, who aren't abandoning, these allies, who are doing whatever it is that they can. There's a great moment where a character says, all you could affect was what you could reach, what you could touch. That was all you could do. And so, but I think that in America, and probably in other places, when you think of heroes, you think of heroes as winning the day. You kind of think of victory. You don't think of, like, disaster and So when these guys came back, even though they acted heroically, and in my mind they were heroes, they didn't view themselves as that. They saw the whole incident overall as shameful, and they never considered themselves as. So you should tell that story about Dick Armitage, because
that's good.
Richard Armitage is a guy who people has had a complicated career as a public servant, but in this instance played a significant hand in leading 30,000 South Vietnamese refugees by boats to freedom. And so you should...
Yeah, so he ends up playing a very heroic part in this story, and almost nobody knows this. And this is a guy who's very well known in politics and has had high offices over the course of the last 30 years, and almost nobody knows the fact that he pretty much single-handedly, along with his South Vietnamese counterpart, saved 30,000 people during this dramatic moment. So it's kind of an extraordinary thing, and I had come across his story somehow, somewhere, and so we wanted to incorporate it into the film, which we did. And then the film came out, and we had some screenings in D.C., and I got an email from Richard Armitage's son, who's in his 20s, thanking me for making the film and saying that he never knew this story about his dad. I think if I saved 30,000 people, my children would know. But I think it's a combination of, I think he does actually have a certain humility, but I think it also speaks to this notion that Mark referenced earlier, which is that there was really no space for heroes in this war. And even, and I think at that time, it was hard to distinguish, and I think we're more sophisticated now as a nation, the difference between what the troops were doing and what was happening on the policy level. Those things are conflated, right? So, but I think over the years, we've been educated, right, to not blame the troops, right? Don't blame the troops in the 1980s, whatever. So I think we can distinguish between those things a little bit better now, but I think that was really not available to us as a nation. But maybe we could show the next clip, which is the moment on the USS Kirk, so let me just set up this clip for those of you who haven't seen the film. So at this point, the evacuation has been called. We've been told, the United States, that we have 24 hours to get out of Vietnam. And the airport, which was the main evacuation route, the intended evacuation route if we needed evacuation, had been bombed by the North. So that had been shut down. So the U.S. scrambled. We redirected the evacuation point to be the embassy, the main point to be the embassy. And there was a fleet of ships out in the South China Sea, which had the helicopters. So the helicopters would go from that fleet in the South China Sea, fly to the embassy, pick up people who were in the embassy, both Americans and Vietnamese who had made it inside the embassy. There were about 2,000 people inside the embassy at this point, and would fly them back to the fleet. And so this, well, I think that sets you up enough to then show this clip and what happens to one of the ships, the USS Kirk, who is out in the sea. And they're really there to protect the fleet. They're not part of the fleet. They're a military ship meant to protect the fleet. But they're closer to the land. They're in between the fleet and the land. And so this is what happens.
So when I watch this clip, I think about the word mercy. That again, what you were referring to earlier, these acts of heroism, that Americans were doing this for their Vietnamese counterparts, but also regular citizens. So why? I guess my main question for this evening is, what do you hope to? Why are you showing this clip tonight? What does it mean to you? What are you showing? What are you demonstrating? What is it?
Well,
saying?
I think first of all, the kind of what was happening, because I think many of us are probably familiar with the helicopter on top of the embassy. Probably the second most known shot or kind of area of awareness is helicopters being pushed off the fleet. So some people are aware of that, but very few people are aware of kind of why are they throwing these helicopters off, who were on these helicopters, what were the circumstances, unpacking that story. And then, this also, I think, shows a moment in the film that is indicative of kind of our larger story, which is this captain who is in this situation, and he's not getting any direction from Washington, and he doesn't know if these are enemies or not. He's making a decision on the fly to bring the first helicopter down. And these people get out, and they basically save their lives. And he then makes the decision, there's no more room for helicopters. What are we going to do? Throw them overboard. These are millions of dollars. He just makes the decision, humans are more important, and we're going to do what we can to save as many of these folks as possible. And the extraordinary thing to us is so many people during this 24-hour period, because this is all within that 24 hours, that last 24 hours of the war, are making these kinds of decisions without any knowledge that anybody else is making these decisions. And they're identifying a problem, and they're saying, we're going to figure out how to save these people. And they consider them their friends, their allies, and they're doing it on their own, and it's an amazing thing, and it's I think kind of great to see. That's why I chose it. Thank you. You want to add anything? But maybe I hate to jump into another clip so quickly, but the next clip is very much related and connected to the same scene, and it's kind of an extension of the same story, and it's really some of my I think my favorite moment in the film, and I think just says anyway. I think it's actually a great 6 minutes of television. So maybe we could watch what happens next.
Wow. What a tale of heroism, and that is remarkable footage. Where did you find this footage?
Well, We got very lucky with his footage. This particular footage, actually, from both of those clips. You know, for the archive of this film, this was dubbed the Living Room War, so there was a lot of people filming, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS, and so we went into their archives and we really dug deep so that we'd get some original footage throughout the film. But this footage I found, I was in Washington, D.C., actually, for a screening of our previous film, Ethel, about my mother. Thank you. And thank you. And we were developing this film, but there were a bunch of people in D.C. who we were interested in profiling, and so I had invited them to the screening of Ethel so I could meet them, and you know, they could see my work and get to know them a little bit. And so I was telling one of these people at the reception how I wanted to profile the story of the USS Kirk. And he worked with the Department of the Navy and had helped uncover the story of the Kirk. And so I was talking to him about it, and he said, you know, he came up to me actually after the screening, and he said, you know, I was thinking about our discussion, and I talked to a sailor who was on the Kirk about 6 months ago, and he said he had just gone up to his attic and found a box of Super 8 undeveloped footage from the Kirk in 1975. Do you think you'd have interest in that? I said, yes. And I was like, I need his name and number right now. And I made him go look in his cell phone and write it down. And I called him. I then flew back to LA and I called him at 9 o'clock the next morning, his time. And he was really wonderful, but he was very protective of the footage. And so he wouldn't let me FedEx it out here. So I sent him an airplane ticket. This is, you know, we had no idea what was in it. He didn't know what was in it. But in any case, so we flew him out here and we got the footage transferred, and it was a treasure trove. So pretty much all the footage you just saw in those last two clips are all his footage. And so, you know, we're so grateful to him, and he's been wonderful, and he came to the premiere at Sundance, and he's been terrific. And it plays throughout the film, but of course his footage is really what we see in the water, but a lot of the film does take place out at sea. So I think that he really helped, you know, bring these stories to life, and I'm so grateful.
Well, and such a heroic tale not on the American part, well, some on the American part, but on the South Vietnamese.
Right.
Things we don't hear about very often.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I would say, and I think it's a good point, Art, you know, in showing folks this movie, and particularly Vietnamese who've come to so many of the screenings, I had sort of thought of the film when we were making it as the story of the U.S. leaving Vietnam. But to a lot of Vietnamese people, it's the story of the Vietnamese coming to America. And, you know, this is really when the Vietnamese came to our country. There were very few before 75. And then in the events in this film, and then in the, you know, on the boats and in subsequent years, the Vietnamese started coming. And I think it's very powerful from their point of view, seeing the determination and the courage and the desperation wanting to get here, and us taking them in, and all that the Vietnamese have since contributed, which is they've been an enormous, you know, wonderful, you know, population to have added to ours. So, you know, when you hear the stories so much in the press these days of sort of the immigrant journey, particularly in boats, you know, that we're seeing these horrible images out of Europe, and you think of what people will do and what they'll go through. And, you know, one of the things the U.S. really got right, and Rory's Uncle Teddy was a big part of it, was the policy we set up to bring so many Vietnamese here, to let them into our country, and to help them assimilate into the population, so that one generation later, I mean, they're doing, you know, they're doing amazing things. Anyways, but yeah. I do think.
And I want to ask a question about that, but perhaps do you want to see the last clip first, and then we can talk about?
Sure. Yeah. So this last clip is really takes place during the very early morning hours of September, I guess, 30th. So this is 24 hours later, basically. It's 20 hours later. It's in the middle of the night, and we're at the embassy, and the helicopters have been going back and forth all evening. The ambassador, who in the beginning of the film kind of comes across as this evil villain on some level, who doesn't accept that the South Vietnam is falling. He refuses to put an evacuation order. And as a result of that, many people weren't able to get out of the country. But once it was evident that there was no other choice, and the country was falling, and we only had 24 hours to leave, he kind of proved himself enormously heroic himself, and he stayed at the embassy until 3:45 in the morning, and he limited the number of Americans that were put on the helicopters to try to get as many Vietnamese in those helicopters as possible, because he knew once all of the Americans were gone that they would stop the evacuation. And so he spent all day and all night, and he only got on a helicopter when there was a presidential order telling him he had to get on a helicopter, which is, hard to say no to when the president tells you. So he gets on the helicopter at 3:45. So I think this clip is now clear, hopefully.
So that is very emotional, this betrayal and then the regret. So all these decisions were being made in Washington with these huge consequences for the people there.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that, you really feel with Stu Harrington and talking to him that he's racked with guilt about this moment. And he would say how he lived in fear of running into one of these 420 people that he left behind, all of his life. And and you really see these policies made in Washington, and then the individuals who are on the front lines of these wars who have to kind of bear the brunt of that and have that on their shoulders. When we had the premiere of this film at Sundance, I think now about a year and a half ago, a number of people from the film came to the premiere. It was the first time we had seen it, other than on a small screen. It was the first time anybody in the film had seen the film. And there were probably about 12 or 13 people who had been in the film who came to that screening. So I was anxious about it, but it was a wonderful screening with about 800 people there. And everybody who was in the film then came up with me on the stage afterwards to do the Q&A. And during the course of the Q&A, somebody asked the question of Stu Harrington about how he felt about this moment. And he talked about how he felt so guilty and terrible and had nightmares about it and really lived in fear of running into one of these 420. And Bin Pho, who you saw in the film, who had been the student who had been one of the 420 left behind, was also on stage. And he then took the microphone and said to Stu Harrington, "I want you to know I forgive you." And he then proceeded to tell the story about how what happened to him, and he was left there, and it took about 5 years, and some of which was spent in prison there and doing hard labor and whatnot. But that at the end, he felt like it was the right course and path for him, and that he had learned so much from it, and he was so actually grateful to Stu Harrington for having left him behind. But it was a really wonderful moment. And then over the course of the next year, we kind of took this film out together and did a number of screenings and across the country and in theaters and other places. And Stu Harrington and Bin Pho would often come with us and talk together. And so they kind of went on this really wonderful journey together and built this wonderful relationship over the course of this time. And I remember we were in Utah, and Mark and I have obviously seen the film a lot, so it was the premiere there, and well, anyway, it wasn't the premiere. It was a screening in Salt Lake City, but it was maybe 500 people. It was a packed audience. It was a really wonderful screening, and it was just prior to the broadcast, and we were outside in the lobby, and then Stu Harrington came out, and then to go to the bathroom, I guess. But anyway, and then And then Ben Pho came out, and then Ben Pho sort of paused with us, and I said, well, Ben, what are you doing out here? And he said, I never trust that man when he goes to take a leak. So, you know, he has a wonderful sense of humor. And then there was, I'll just take one other moment, which was nice, which is when, you know, the film got nominated for an Academy Award, which we were so thrilled by. Thank you. And so, you know, we were ecstatic about that, and then, of course, immediately challenged about how do we get tickets, because it's impossible, even if you're nominated, to get tickets for everybody. But anyway, we were lucky enough to be able to get most of our gang in there, which included Stu Harrington and Ben Pho. So I called, you know, both of them to see if they would join us for this, and Stu Harrington had said, you know, he was thrilled. And then I called Ben Pho, and I told him Stu was coming, and the rest of the crew and everybody, and he was very excited. And then he paused, and he said, you know, who would have thought 40 years ago, when I was left at that embassy, that I would be going to the Academy Awards with the guy who left me there. So anyway, it's a sweet story.
And I think that's a great story to end this portion of our evening. So we're going to have some questions, but first I want to just thank both of you for your graciousness, your thoughts about this, kind of thinking deeply about what you have made, and then allowing us to see portions of that tonight.
Well, thank
you.
You've been great, Laura. Thank you. And thank you all.